Paul,
Hey.
thanks for coming back on. This is number 3.
Yeah, man. Thanks for reaching out to me.
You're welcome for bugging you to talk to me.
Oh yeah, I always love chatting with you. We were just saying that because you and I haven't chatted off the record in a while. I'm happy chatting with you on or off the record. So
I
if
appreciate it.
It has to be on the record, I'll take it.
Hopefully we get a good 50-50 split at least.
I would hope so. Yeah.
So yeah, today we're gonna be talking about GitHub Co-Pilot.
Oh,
and everyone seems to have an opinion on it. So I thought we should have an opinion on it and wanted to talk about your opinion. So disclaimer, neither you or I have been able to develop with it on our local computers, but doing some research, we can talk about what we think this means for the engineering community, first impressions, things we think are good, maybe things we're concerned about, and go from there.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Do you think I could share my screen so we could look at their
Yes.
like marketing site for it?
Yes. Do you have permission to do that?
Let me see if I can. Here we go. Let's try it out. Are we in?
Yes, we're in.
Cool. All right. So here's their marketing site for GitHub Co-Pilot. It's a fascinating piece of technology, and is right in line with all of the trendy AI projects that are out there, like projects that generate arts and all sorts of things. But hey, if we can generate stuff, why don't we generate code? And so this is your AI pair programmer. And so let me replay the little demo. Me as a developer, I start typing something, and then boom, Copilot suggests a whole body for my function just based on my function name. And that is pretty fascinating product that they're promoting here. So with a whole bunch of different languages, here the developer would just be typing in the description of a function, and then it's going to be spitting out some code.
That's insane.
Yeah, quite insane. And if this was like your first introduction to something that's AI generated, like your mind would be absolutely blown. We've seen like more and more projects like this in the wild, and but this is still super impressive. At least it's impressive offering.
And so what do you think this compares to in other industry, or I guess other artificial intelligence realms, like in art?
That's a really good question. Some things I've been really impressed with. Let me see if I can find it. I'm here in Brave, which I don't have like JavaScript enabled by default, so we'll see how well this works. You see, I'm looking up Barbie coloring sheet for myself, obviously. There's some like NVIDIA does really interesting art machine learning demo. Let me see if I can see this. Is this it? Would this be one of them? I'm probably gonna have to enable JavaScript. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, there's some really interesting stuff. So this is, do you see this over here to the left?
Mm-hmm. Oh wow.
That's all that the user is entering, and then what's over there to the right is all that's being generated. Like AI and machine learning is becoming quite sophisticated to where we're still defining a clear problem set, but based on the problem set, it's able to do pretty remarkable things. And so similarly here, you have a problem set. Here's context of code, and it's more than just auto-completing it, but it's actually going to be generating what it thinks would be the right code for you. And given all of the constraints and all of the data that GitHub has about code, like it would be the result is certainly remarkable, at least what it's offering here. We
Right.
haven't said, this is all just assuming it works as intended.
I saw some videos using using it. This guy Fireship.io did like some programming and brought up some really interesting points. I think from like a first impressions perspective, I think this is a really cool tool where I could see myself using this day to day is maybe I want to find out like, oh, how do I get in how do I see if a string is an anagram? I don't know, like some weird example, right?
Sure.
So instead of like Stack Overflow looking, copy paste, playing this, because I think it pulls from Stack Overflow and GitHub public projects. It would be, the feedback loop would be way quicker. Like I want this of a string, and then it'll just generate, and then you can iterate on that. So I don't think this is going to replace, at least in the short term, this isn't going to replace like a full developer workflow, but I think it will assist in like engineering productivity tools.
Right. I think that's clearly, I think, how it is, how it's packaged, like your pair programming. And
that's a good point.
And it's an interesting way and I think that's the right way to do it. And they clearly had, for any of these machine learning projects to work, you do have to have a clear set of requirements.
Right.
Machine learning can't just come up with the problem on itself. It's clearly not, hey, just describe to us what your program is and we'll build it for you. This is meant to, and GitHub being a, developer oriented product, like this is solving developers' real-time problems. I kind of need this thing. Or maybe even while I'm typing, it can, I maybe even while I'm filling out the body of it, it can start finishing.
Right.
So I want to just go through some more interesting words that they're using to describe this. So they're talking about it being more than autocomplete, because we as developers, we have a number of code intelligence tools where we can just autocomplete like the parameters for a function that it's expecting or whatever. But what they're saying this does is quite phenomenal about how much code it can generate. So it's not just finding code and copy and pasting it. It's actually, their process is actually generating it. And there's some interesting questions later on too that talk about like licensing concerns, like is this code owned by GitHub since it's generated by their thing, and they describe that no, this is all your code. And but I think that's an interesting point too, is because of the way machine learning works, this isn't just like a classification problem. This is actually trying to generate something. So man, and so here's an interesting case. Like, so here's JavaScript. Like, we as JavaScript engineers, you can imagine how much, and this is one of the things it's used as a competitor towards, would be like just Googling up stuff. So it's like, I want to do this thing. I want to see what's the best way to do it in JavaScript. Let me Google calculate days between dates in JavaScript, whatever. And then we'd find some code and then copy and paste it and hopefully understand it, what's going on, or we would just copy and paste it. But this is all integrated in your editor and is almost even understanding your intention too. So it's like, I'm not making a Google query. It understands all the context. So hopefully it has even more context than my Google query. So its promise is really interesting. So they talk about too, converting comments to code, because the more context you give it, the better it would behave, because it's going to be able to, that's going to constrain the output to what it expects. Autofill repetitive code. Oh my goodness. Tests without the toil. This, I think, is one of the most exciting parts of it, of show me alternatives. So it's not just going to do, it's not going to generate just one one bit for you, but I can also see a number of different alternatives for uh, approaches or whatever it's finding, and then I can figure out, oh, I'm just going to accept this one or something, and that's interesting. Um, and this is another really interesting part of its package too. Is if I'm just really unfamiliar in a code base. So we talked about, hey, in our day to day how we might use it, and that's in our familiar domain in JavaScript, how we may use it. But imagine learning a new language or even just complete newcomers to the field, how much quicker they'd be able to produce. I think that's the promise, which is really attractive.
Yeah, that's an interesting, like maybe you have a side project and you're like, I want to spin up a node server, but you don't really want to spend time Googling like the params object schema, right? This will just do it for you. Or maybe I want to do a SQL query that's a little bit complicated, and you can, like, I don't know how sophisticated it gets, like if it can read your local database, but say like, I want to get this from this, that might be cool. I don't know.
I'd imagine it can get a lot of context. Like I can imagine you get context from your entire project you're working on too. Like I think it's that's really interesting.
I think where this, based on something you just said about like having the options, I don't know if this is a thing right now. In that Fireship video I watched, sometimes the options that it derives are more or less the same, but where I think this could be super interesting is saying you have a constraint at work, like maybe you have a perform, like I need to get an item from a list, but I need the most performant way to do that given my language constraints. If you can have like an optimization flag that's like optimizing for space, optimizing for time, then you essentially just guide like, hey, I need to make this DOM query improvement. Like, yes, I have a list. So now your job becomes, I've seen people talk about this with artificial intelligence, your job becomes like a constraint moderator and guider than it is like an actual programmer.
Sure. Yeah. And that's I think the offering. It is really interesting, where I could describe with comments what I want it to spit out. And maybe keywords like performance and stuff would already like navigate it to the right decision. It's really, really fascinating. And you can imagine from a management perspective, it's that might be struggling with onboarding newcomers to a code base, or even like a maintainer's perspective of, we want people to write code that's consistent with our guidelines. Something like this could be really, sounds really nice.
Yeah.
And it is very interesting and fascinating. And here's a whole bunch of interesting quotes. And I think some of their use cases are interesting to highlight too. Like, here's a quote talking about the pains of navigating if you're just completely unfamiliar with the language and you're trying to learn about it, just Googling things. And it's definitely a struggle, but it sounds like using GitHub Copilot, you just are able to take off and be productive really quickly. This talked about the ability to go through suggestions. I think that's really, really interesting. This one's interesting too, like just using it, they learned about a nuance and some specific JavaScript object comparison. And as you'd kind of hope from a pair programmer, like there's a whole different bank of experience,
right,
that could be navigating you and helping you. And I think that's one of its huge benefits is, here's some really cool suggestions you might not have thought of built from across the entire code world out there. And that is really attractive, I think, to how that can individually diversify my thinking. Of if I see automatically different kind of suggestions of like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of doing it like that.
Mm.
I can see being really personally really valuable. Um, so these questions are interesting to highlight. One of them, I think we talked about, like, this is all assuming that it works, and uh, I mentioned too, the questions like, does it, um, who owns the code that ends up
Yeah.
getting generated by this? And it's cool that they're not being shady about, who's actually owning the code.
Right.
But we talked a lot about just some pros here and the exciting things about what's offering. But my I'm a little bit of a cranky old person and don't like new things. So I might have a little bit of bias, but uh this concerns me. Um and I want to hear you challenge me. I also want to hear your personal, first thoughts, positive and negative towards it. I can keep sharing my screen or I can stop sharing. What do you want to do?
Yeah. Stop. Yeah. Stop sharing so we can see your face.
Yeah. Now what's personally your like first impressions? And I know you've been thinking about this for a little bit, but positive and negative, where are you at?
Yeah. First positive impression, improved engineering productivity on a day-to-day basis. Also with maybe some ideas, like some new ideas maybe I haven't seen, like kind of like that. There was, I think the co-founder of Instagram was one of the quotes, and it's like, oh, I just learned this new JavaScript object comparison nuance that I had never learned before. Like the amount of time that saves is awesome. Probably decrease in edge cases, edge case bugs that you see because you might have a little maybe more robust programming. Maybe I'm naive to think about that. First impression negative. So the information that this is being pulled from is from any open project, I guess Stack Overflow and GitHub. And so the quality of the recommendations, I'm a little question a little bit. Not like just when you're pulling that much information, how, right? Like if let's say I want to iterate through a list, and then like, okay, well, you use for each, okay, but there's like 8 ways to do that in JavaScript, and you need to know context to do that. So
Yes.
are you going to be spending more time kind of like parsing, like with cognitive dissonance, like parsing through these things and thinking like, oh, that's not right, I need to do this, maybe it's not my use case, instead of spending the time becoming better at your craft? That's kind of,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah, first negative impression. Trying to think what else. I know you had some thoughts in terms of like personal versus industry that I'd like to talk to you about, but what are your first positive
Yeah.
impressions?
For me, I think it would be really cool to find something that could, I think I would love, and I love getting feedback from just anybody of like, have you considered doing it this way? I love pair programming with people is awesome. And I had not considered pair programming with an AI. And it would be really interesting to have an AI say, have you considered doing this?
Mm-hmm.
There is one thing, I'm going to put a pin here. We can go down it right now, but there's something significantly different between this and pair programming, which is a significant difference.
Okay.
But that, like, hey, we can just condense a whole diverse alternative stuff for me to consider. I love that because I feel like the more diversity we can get, the more we can escape a rut that I may be in with programming, or it may give me just a totally different vantage point on the problem or at hand or whatever. But that's also kind of the part that concerns me with the machine learning aspect of it is you think about if this kind of thing is if this was widely available, and especially to already think of how many software engineers become software engineers by just following tutorials on the internet. This
Right.
is replacing that, or
Right.
just Stack Overflow. This is replacing that. So imagine learning software engineering, you have some idea you want to do, and you're using this thing, and I that's going to happen at scale where you're not going to have people that have a deep understanding of what's going on
Mm.
using this tool to, for them, they really do want to kind of autocomplete. They'll describe things that they want to have happen, but it's kind of
Mhm.
autocompleting. Um, and I could see the more and more that happens, it's like with YouTube, like search recommendations. Once you view a couple of things, then all of your recommendations are now
Right.
like
Right.
tailored towards this thing. You're like, okay, but I kind of want something different.
Right.
And that whole thing that we're, I think quite fatigued in the social media world of, I just feel like an algorithm is generating this. I
Mm.
would be really concerned about that with software. If it's like, okay, this is code that works, but we've actually now lost the diversity and ingenuity
Mm.
because there's so many actors that are just, we're just doing the thing that gives me the immediate win.
Right.
That that concerns me with this applied to the industry, especially with newcomers to these languages and stuff. And I think that I'm concerned about, amongst other things. One of the things on their, well, before I go on, do you have any thoughts or feelings about industry-wide adoption and how that could affect the product and affect newcomers to the industry? Or
Yeah. So I think you raise a really interesting point. Sounds like your concern is like once you start suggesting, then the feedback loop becomes machine suggesting, you taking suggestion. There's no more ingenuity and creativity amongst the community, which you could argue is already happening in terms
sure,
of people on open source projects. Like, let's say we have a group of front end engineers that have never read an old computer science book, that aren't aware of like basic reusability patterns, right? There's patterns that I don't know about that could help my job. So when you so we use Vue at work. Vue has constraints based on the type of reusability that you could use. So that's where my problem set goes. That doesn't mean that means that I'm going to be thinking in these like very distinct patterns where I'm not going to be able to think in more creative kind of general use case patterns. I could probably work them in, but on a day-to-day it might be harder. So you could argue that's already happening. I do agree that's an issue.
I do want to interrupt
Yeah,
because
go ahead.
I think this is leading up to, here's my biggest concern,
Cool.
is what motivates people to be, and I can't think of the right word, to be creative, to be ingenuitive.
Okay.
That's not a word. But what's going to motivate you to like step back and to like, I need to rethink this. And
Yeah, personal.
for me,
Intrinsic, right?
I think it's the pain. It's the pain of writing code. It's the best MRs delete code,
Yeah.
and some of the best MRs only introduce just a few lines of the right code or figure out ways to like, how do we get this code down? Because
Mm.
code isn't, for a number of reasons, but for one, it isn't just written. It needs to be read and understood. And because it will need to change. And if we reduce the pain of writing code, there becomes less of a motivation for, how do I do this a different way? How do I abstract and encapsulate so I'm not repeating myself all the time? Or there's, say if something like here introduces tie coupling, or like something that gets, um, suggested by the co-pilot, uh, introduces tight coupling or whatever. And um, that's the biggest concern is for me is the problem it's addressing. It's only addressing the symptom. It's addressing the
Mm,
symptom of having to write code that I don't understand. Code should be really easy to understand, and if it's not, you're what I'd be concerned about is an organization that looks like we're super productive, but in the midst there's like a cancer growing. And that is a danger that's quite real of healthy metrics can success can mask uh cancers that will get you.
right.
And and maybe there's a more like complete automated tool set for giving you, being able to automate all this. But I do think there's something about just like if with any kind of pain you have, you don't want to just take time. Like you want to
Right.
understand, why do I have this pain? If I just take Tylenol all the time, your body's telling you something is wrong,
Right.
And so I personally, uh like I don't use a big IDE. That's just my personal decision, and part of it is all around that is I like to I like to feel the pain of writing code, because then it encourages me to write less code and to figure out more creative ways to do that. That's my biggest concern. I think that organizations could overlook with this. I think if you're really comfortable in your domain, it's a really neat tool for getting suggestions to challenge yourself to think outside of your box. But at the organization level, and if you're in a domain you're not familiar with, I'd be really concerned about it, because that pain is a really helpful signal and of writing code. And I
Mhm.
don't that wrestling with it helps you understand what's going on, because it's not just writing the code. You're gonna have to read it and change it later. That's a,
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
No, I really like the way you put that. An example I can think of. So let's say an organization decides to go this route with the way this is going right now. Then they realize they have a serious issue in their product that needs to be addressed using like decoupling and basic software engineering principles. And then the engineers that you hired to do this don't understand that. Then even if someone hired you to come into this code base, you're like, this is going to take me a year to get to a point where I feel good about it, and it alleviates the stress that the organization's having. It's like like you said, it's like masking the pain to a point of no return, right? And you see that in some organizations as well. Like they just have this legacy code that's like, oh yeah, we don't touch that. But then one day products like this like this feature is a priority, and you're like trying to replace a button, and you're like, this is going to take us months. And they're like, to replace a button, it's like, I mean, yeah, you have
Yeah.
to look at what we're looking at, right? So I think that's something I didn't think about. That's a really interesting point.
And I think that like this probably isn't the right word, but reductionist thinking and hyper focus on a problem rather than this holistic complex system, it can breed monsters at times.
Mm,
And I think this is a tool, and under the right, with so I would just some things that really excite me and what I'd be excited to use it for would be challenging me to think outside the box. But for an organization that would think, oh, this is going to improve our developer productivity and things, is um, that might be highlighting the wrong metric. And you may see, you may be feeling great for a little bit, and then when things
yeah.
get tough, it's going to be it's going to be tough. But there's some things that are really cool. I think just seeing code suggestions is so powerful. And I do want to highlight, because there's a quote about this as an alternative to Google searching. I would really like to highlight my favorite alternative to Google searching that already exists. But I also want to I also have some suggestions that can protect from this kind of thing. Like, because there's already, developers that may just find code on the internet, copy and paste it, and like that I don't totally understand what's going on, but I, somehow figured out how this works. And there's some things that you can set in your organization to make sure that even though it works, it's the best, it's still understandable, and you'll be able to revisit it. And it's not like it just works for now and then we don't touch it, because those are really scary systems to maintain. So I have some suggestions, and I have an alternative I want to dive into. Do you have any? Do you have a preference?
No, go for it.
Okay. So I'm thinking, if I was at an organization and this was widely available, and maybe I had the insight to be concerned about, we're able to push out so much code really fast. I would emphasize this place's special importance on code review. Because code isn't just written, it also needs to be read and understood. And that code review bit challenges, can I read and understand this easily to someone that didn't write? That's one of the things that's scary with this AI pair programming. That's at the very top. It said, Co-Pilot, your AI pair programmer. And I said, there's some significant differences here between a pair programmer and this thing. And one of the differences is, you can pair program in a number of different ways, but if I'm driving, that person's hands aren't going to be slapping on top of my hands or whatever. If they have an idea, they have to coherently and simply describe their idea of how it's going to work. And we have to both understand it before it has to go through two heads before it gets to my fingers. If it doesn't even have to go through my head, and all I have to do is just hit a button and I get code on the screen, that's like the opposite of a pair programmer, because now you've replaced that really valuable human oversight of, are we doing the best, most profitable thing here, with something we may not be able to understand later.
This is almost synonymous with like having a driving partner navigate versus Google Maps navigating you, right? It feels like the same thing. It's like turn left. Like, okay, but do I want, like, this thing is not pair programming, it's driving directions, like, do this. And then when you, I don't know about you, then have you ever tried recently, have you tried just navigating without the thing? And it's in a new area, it's like kind of terrifying because you don't have orientation.
Yeah. No, you bring up and that's, I'm becoming, I said I was a cranky old person. I'm becoming increasingly concerned as technology progresses. Like, you think about phone numbers. We used to memorize phone numbers. And now I don't even know if I have the capability to memorize people's phone numbers because I don't have to.
Right.
So I think this, if it became really popular and widely used, it would change the scene. And I think you would see it create new problems that would have interesting solutions. Like, I think because it would change the people of the industry, because I do think it has that effect. But I do think one of the most exciting, so I mentioned a suggestion of code review, as that's super important here, because maybe I was able to write it all real fast with my AI pair programmer. And in reality, I kind of checked it, but I ran it locally and it works. having another head asynchronously being able to consume it and understand it is super valuable. But what's going to happen in your organization if everyone is able to write way faster than we're able to read? Like, I don't know what the answer is, but it's interesting. The other suggestion, though, and this is a suggestion I would have for a co-pilot. The part that really excites me is being able to see alternatives. I would be really interested, and rather than it predicting what I want and putting that in place, I would really be interested in seeing what's already there and suggesting something else. That is really exciting for me. I would love to, and that could even be like that could even be just like a bot that's running regularly to just create MRs that might improve things. Of like, I would love to see. Don't autocomplete my thoughts, because I don't want to. I'd like to escape that local maximum by having new thoughts, but do keep suggesting alternative. Really helpful. So the part that I'm least excited about is we're putting code where there was no code before. The part I'm most excited about is here's code and here's a bunch of different other codes like it that you may not have considered.
Right. Yeah. I agree. I think one thing yeah. I agree with you. The thing that I think I'm most concerned about talking about this is, so like Google Gmail, you can write an email and then it'll like fill in the rest of your sentence. But then you can turn that off, but you find that you start writing like the thing suggests. And if I'm writing a unit test or whatever test that's suggesting based on 3 of me in the wild of GitHub, but Martin Fowler is nowhere to be seen, I don't really want my own biases, and the quality of the unit test is probably going to be way lower than if you have someone like, if I could pull from Martin Fowler's books, right? Like you want to be, to your point about suggestions, I want to be learning as I'm going. I don't want to be constantly being told what to do, especially I'm not like trying to bash anyone on the internet, but especially with like subpar code. Like, I don't know if the artificial intelligence, like the machine learning model is like, I've identified that these people are on the ECMAScript committee and have contributed to the core of JavaScript. And so that we deem that their solutions are actually weighted higher than, I don't think that's a thing. So if that was, I'd feel a little bit more confident, but it's kind of, I'm going to be really harsh. It feels like you're getting some suggestion. You're getting suggestions watered in from like potential, let's say we're speaking, this is Grammarly. We're getting suggestions from people that are first graders just learning how to read and write.
Yeah, you're definitely going to be at the best adopting some weighted average of what's out there in the industry. And however, those weights could be off, but also the whole industry could be off. Like, so think of security concerns. Like,
great point.
And that's what's most concerning too, is I think in some regards, what might be the norm in a language, especially really new language, that needs creativity and needs feedback of this is a pain to write. And like masking all of that is really concerning. And also adopting like, okay, now we're able to put all this code out, but maybe we've just propagated all of the security vulnerability we weren't concerned with, like we weren't aware of or something. And that's one of the questions they have there is like, hey, is this going to produce secure code? And it was just, and it, transparently said, hey, we're only as, in more or less words, we're only as good as, what's put in us. And so
Yeah.
um so I don't know. I think it's really interesting, and I think you can look at the world and you can draw similarities to things out in the wild. Um and that there's some considerable risks with it, like, Tesla having an autopilot. And so some people think, oh, I can just fall asleep while this thing is going, and that's
Mhm. Yeah.
not quite the case. The And so that I think would be really concerning, is what can get sold at the people that are layers removed from the code. That promise is really attractive, but there's a lot of nuance there. And I think the the you want I personally, if tests are a pain to write, I want that feedback. I want to know, this is hard to test. I should probably change the code under the
Mhm.
hood because it's hard to test. And I'd be really concerned if there was a button that just said automatically test everything. And because it's not going to, it's if it was perfect, if it was a very robust machine, it would be pretty close to human. And I'm pretty sure it's not that. So
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think
but
kind of feel. Yeah, go ahead.
no, I think it is interesting. And I think there's some good things with it. Would be pulling from the Tesla example, um you have the promise of, with fully automated driving, it's safer. um and that would be really cool to be able to catch issues by comparing the code that I'm writing to uh the code out in the wild. um and so I don't want to just be super dismissive of, you're not coding if you're not, we can't, it's not real if it's not human or something. But um I do think that the net benefit here is questionable,
Mm.
as it stands. I would love to see, rather than completing code, I'd love to see with written code, let's make suggestions. It's kind of what Grammarly does, and I love that. Of like, with I write my sentence and then it's like, hey, here's some edits. Have you
Right,
considered?
right.
And I think that is, I am really attracted to that, and I would love to see a an AI pair programmer that makes suggestions like that.
Mm.
Um, that would be interesting.
That's almost like a more sophisticated linting tool, right? Like, right. Linting is kind of like the Grammarly of based on specific rules and language, but there's like implementation details that linting cannot provide. Like, have you considered?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, like refactoring, decoupling. Have you considered doing this? Have you considered using this object type?
Even if it was a completely different looking function, but I think building it off of the function I was writing first,
Mm,
um,
would it
I
alleviate a
think
lot of your concern?
I think it would produce overall a better, healthy uh, code base and industry, if, rather than we're just going to pull from context and complete what you're
Yeah.
trying to do, if it if if it was able to kind of build off of what was already there and make suggestions. I think that would be interesting. I do have, I mentioned, I know we're going a little long, but I did want to show one alternative to Google searching. This is my favorite way,
Yeah, please.
absolute favorite way to learn a new language. Not spoken language, computer language. Um, so one of the comments here was like, trying to code an unfamiliar language by Googling everything. They were like, man, that doesn't work. So my favorite way to learn a new language these days is to use Sourcegraph. Have we talked about SourceGraph?
No.
All right, so it does require JavaScript, like everything does. But I was, learning. I'm really interested in Rust these days, and I'm trying to learn Rust more, and I'm trying to learn like this language called, or not this language, this library called uh, Tokyo in Rust. Um, and this is about doing like asynchronous things or whatever. And I can look at the API docs, and when I'm looking at some uh, functions I might need, or yeah, let me see if I can go here. Oh yeah. Yes. Um, yeah. So let's say like I was reading on a tutorial somewhere, or like I was looking at some example, and like I think I need something like this, but I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing. Um, it really, really is helpful for me to see not sandbox code examples, not Stack Overflow code examples, because all of those can be quite idealistic and can be removed from the reality of a real project. Is really helpful for me to see things in the wild. So SourceGraph is this all public code that it has indexed all the public code from GitLab and from GitHub, from a whole bunch of different code repositories.
Wow.
And it's basically a search that even supports regex and other things for searching code out in the wild. So like if I was curious about how use state or use memo and TypeScript, or like for those are React functions, here's one of their example searches. And I'll just see a whole bunch of code out there in the wild of projects using that match that search request. So it helps if you know regex and you can kind of do a sophisticated search. But for me, like I'm looking for Rust, and I'm really interested in let's say here I was really interested in something that's doing some of the TCP stream. And I can see some examples for that. And those is actually really helpful for me. And it gave me more things to query off of their API docs and stuff. Like I find myself Googling things less and less, and more often having the API docs or the language docs paired with this, seeing things out in the wild, and then let me try to read the documentation on that and try to understand it.
That's awesome. So are these just random projects on open source?
Random projects.
Oh wow. Okay, cool.
You can filter off of so here's like a list of a whole bunch of different repositories that are matched on it. But highly recommend checking it out. So it's quite sophisticated things you can filter off of it. So here it looks like you can even filter off of commits too. Like, so it's
wow,
a whole bunch of code information, all public code information. I'm always impressed with how fast I get results. And just looking up examples and reading API docs, super helpful for me.
Wow. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome.
Yeah. That's an alternative to the Googling that Copilot is an alternative towards.
Cool. Awesome.
That's my rant about Copilot, man.
I appreciate it. I learned a lot. Hopefully the next time we talk, you're on the wait list for it. So we can pair on, maybe we can take down like an issue in GitLab and use Copilot.
I would love to see that. I'd love to see how it plays out. It scares me.
It scares me too. It's okay.
If I'm like, if it does my job for me,
time to find a new job.
I may not post that video because it'd be like, what are we paying this guy for?
Awesome.
I'm joking.
Well, cool. Thank you so much for talking through that and bringing up those points.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on and hosting this so that we can
always
share ideas and talk about it. It's interesting. At the very least, it's interesting to see what happens.
Totally. Yeah, it's a step somewhere. Where will it go? No one knows.
Oh man. All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.